Hello and welcome to MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things magic. In this video, we are going to update and upgrade our Scion of the Ur-Dragon EDH deck. All right, MTGBC, we've got to talk. And what we have to talk about is what happened during the last couple of appearances that this Scion of the Ur-Dragon deck made on our Up and Up series. In the most recent installments specific for this deck, we attempted to depower and become a little less dependent on our general for the purposes of enhancing the Dragon tribe and the tribal synergies within the 99. Well, since the last time this deck appeared on the Up and Up series, after extensive gameplay, I'm here to let the MTGBC know we can't have it both ways. We cannot have Scion as a commander in a dedicated Dragon tribal deck. It just doesn't work that way. We either need to get rid of Scion as the commander and go all out Dragon tribal shenanigans, or we need to maintain Scion and reshape the 99 to make it all things Scion. And since this is a Scion of the Ur-Dragon EDH deck, our goal is to keep Scion and return Scion to its prominent role as one of the most feared commanders in the format. So in this video today, during this Up and Up series installment, we are going to turn over some of the current cards in the 99 of this build to make it much more Scion powerful. That's right, Scion powerful. You look for it, it's going to become a brand. So what we're going to do is, after dissecting the various categories of this deck, reanimation, removal, ramp, card advantage, all of those different categories are each going to become slightly less powerful after a slight weakening of them by taking a card or two out in order to make the synergies with Scion that much stronger. As this video unfolds, you'll see exactly what I mean in trying to make Scion as feared as it should be and not being a face commander to a Dragon tribal deck. Another thing that we're also going to do with that in the back of our minds, not too far back, of course, but we're also going to spend some time to make this deck quicker. We want to have a little more ramp. We want to have a little more mana acceleration. We want to make sure that we can out-tempo our opponents in the early and mid-game so that we can get Scion down into play as quickly as possible and then start tipping him sideways and knocking opponents out of the game, or greatly debilitating their resources, and we're going to get to that as this video unfolds. So let's get right to it. With the purposes of speeding things up, going into the 99 is Felwar Stone. This is going to tap to add 1 mana of any color of a land that our opponent controls can produce. I think I said that right. Yeah, we'll say it like that. And in a 5-color deck, we're bound to have some kind of color fixing with this artifact. Note that it is only a CMC of 2, which is going to help us in the early and the mid game as a way in which to power out Scion onto the battlefield that much more quickly. Now, weakening a little bit, slightly weakening our recursion package, out is coming Reanimate. This is a sorcery for just 1 black mana that allows us to put any creature from a graveyard onto the battlefield under our control. We lose life equal to that creature's mana value. Now, for the purposes of this coming out, remember, we have numerous mass recursion spells in the 99 of this build that allows us to pull out all of the dragons that are in our graveyard that have been put there by activating Scion's ability. So by taking out just the Reanimate, which, let's face it, we're most likely just going to use this to bring one of our dragons back into play, we're going to sacrifice that one of as a way in which to include some additional mana ramp. All right, so we got to piece this together. It's all about balance. That doesn't mean that we don't have any recursive packages. We're just taking a card out in order to make the overall deck that much stronger. With more ramp in mind, we also are going to include a copy of Skyshroud Claim. This is a sorcery 3 and a green. We can search our library for up to 2 forest cards and put them onto the battlefield. Note that the forest cards do not have to be basics. So these can be 2 shock lands that have a forest subtype, or they can be 2 triomes that have a forest subtype. And in this Scion deck with 10 shock lands and 6 different triomes, Skyshroud Claim could be inordinately valuable by allowing us to fix our mana and to get more lands onto the battlefield than our opponents. And also keep in mind, with the mana value of 4, this is giving us 2 mana sources. The mana value of 2 for Fellwar Stone is giving us 1 mana value, or giving us 1 mana source. So we did go into this revision with the understanding that we wanted to maximize what we're spending and what we're getting back. So spending 2 mana to get 1 back with Fellwar Stone is similar to spending 4 mana on Skyshroud Claim and getting 2 sources of mana back. With Skyshroud Claim going out, we are going to slightly weaken our overall tutor package by bringing out Mystical Tutor. This is an instant searches for a sorcery, or this is an instant that searches our library for an instant or sorcery card, and then it puts it on top of our shuffled library. We already are playing with Vampiric Tutor. We are already playing with Demonic Tutor, so we can take out a tutor that has less of an impact by just searching for an instant or sorcery spell, keeping in mind this is not a spell-slinging deck, and we are not over-reliant on instants and sorceries as the primary win conditions of this build. That's what this episode is all about, making Scion, once again, the primary win condition of this deck. So we're going to slightly weaken our tutor package to make our deck faster, which again is going to help the overall strength of this build. This card going in was a bit of a surprise that it either wasn't included originally or was pulled out for whatever reason, but it's going back in now for the purposes of protecting our general and giving it much needed haste when it hits the battlefield. And that's going to be a copy of Lightning Greaves. For an equip cost of 0, it's going to give Shroud and haste to the creature that it's equipped to. So for the purposes of casting Scion, we spend our mana, it goes into play, we equip the Lightning Greaves for free, and now all of a sudden we can attack that turn, and if we've got the 2 mana to activate its ability, this is going to stop any spot removal or disruption from our opponents, which makes our job of getting rid of them that much easier. And in this build, we are not targeting Scion with any auras or any other types of equipment. This is the only thing outside of maybe an instant or sorcery spell that we have tucked away that would actually be targeting our general. So with so many cards that are not doing anything to target Scion, having Shroud for a lightning, or having Lightning Greaves provide Shroud, which, let's face it, if a creature has Shroud, if it's one of ours, we can't target it either. But that's not going to be a problem here because we're not targeting Scion with barely anything in this deck. So with Lightning Greaves going in as a way in which to fortify and re-strengthen Scion, we are going to slightly weaken our suite of removal. And in so doing, Krosan Grip is going to come out. This is an instant 2 and a green. It has split second, so as long as this spell is on the stack, no other spells can be played and no activated abilities can be played unless they're mana abilities. This destroys target artifact or enchantment. Many, many moons ago, and this predates this YouTube channel when I had this Scion deck, this was included into the 99 as a way in which to stop these little nifty infinite combos that were played pretty heavily at my LGS at the time. Well, those were many, many moons ago, and so far in the present day, I have not come across anything like that. So with Krosan Grip being there just for the purposes of trying to stop an infinite combo from happening, which would be a game-losing combo for us, we're going to take that out and we're going to put Lightning Greaves in. We're protecting and enhancing Scion and removing a piece of removal that isn't necessarily as powerful as it used to be. All right, a removal spell going in that was not in there before is Crux of Fate. This is going to be 3 and 2 black. It's a sorcery. We choose to destroy all dragon creatures, or we choose to destroy all non-dragon creatures. Historically, I stayed away from spells like this out of the fear of the blue mages digging this out of my library, or out of my hand, or out of my graveyard, and casting it against me. But now that I'm reliant, or should I say I'm becoming more reliant and dependent on Scion leading us to victory, this spell is not as fearful as it once was, with trying to get dragons upon dragons into play in a traditional dragon tribal deck. This card will probably be a no-no, but since we're really just focusing on Scion here, this card has a little more value in a Scion-directed deck versus just a traditional dragon tribal deck. So I have no problem putting Crux of Fate in now, and taking out is going to be Merciless Eviction. Now here we have a removal spell that's very, very good at what it does, as long as it hits what we want it to hit. For 4 and Orzhov colors, we exile all of the following: either it's artifacts, creatures, enchantments, or planeswalkers. Historically, this has bounced around the table being creatures. It's been artifacts. I don't think I've ever cast this to exile planeswalkers, so I'm not sure if that's ever come up. And enchantments too, and those enchantment heavy builds. But again, specific to us, this would not hurt us if we were to cast Merciless Eviction if Scion is on our side of the battlefield. Scion gets exiled, we choose to put it into the command zone, and everything else on the battlefield that are our opponent's creatures, they're all gone. The thought process here was, if Scion is in play and there are creatures that could block him down, casting a Crux of Fate and destroying non-dragon creatures allows Scion to swoop in and deliver that combat damage unblocked, and that's even before we consider tapping 2 to activate its ability that could end up one-shotting or knocking out an opponent with lethal commander damage. We couldn't do that with Merciless Eviction. If Scion's on the battlefield already, Scion's going to get exiled too. So Crux of Fate is going to help us keep Scion in play and hopefully remove all of the other creatures under our opponent's control so that we can send Scion into unblocked combat. That's the thought process for that swapping of cards. All right, next up, we are looking at a different way to get cards into our hand. We're going to swap in 1 enchantment that hopefully will put a good number of cards into our hand, while taking out another enchantment that all of a sudden, now that we're focusing more on Scion and not so much a dragon tribal deck, becomes a little less valuable. The card going in is going to be Mystic Remora. For 1 blue mana, it has a cumulative upkeep of a generic mana. And that means at the beginning of our upkeep, we're going to put an age counter on this, and then if we don't pay mana equal to the number of age counters on it, we have to sacrifice it. So hopefully we can get this down in the early to mid game, get a couple of extra cards into our hand, because whenever an opponent casts a non-creature spell, we draw a card unless that player pays 4. So a turn 1 Mystic Remora, when so many players are casting their Soul Rings, their Mana Crypts, their Arcane Signets, or they're casting their Rampant Growths, they're not going to have the 4 mana to pay. That's going to put more cards into our hand. We're going to gain card advantage. Mystic Remora is going to help us a lot more in the early to mid game, which is going to help us have it's going to help us to have more selections in what we do for the purpose of ramping our side of the battlefield as well as interacting with our opponents. So with Mystic Remora going in, coming out is going to be Garruk's Uprising. This is also an enchantment. It's 2 and a green. When it comes into play, we draw a card if we have a creature if we control a creature with power 4 or greater. And whenever a creature with power 4 or greater comes into play, we draw a card. And this gives all creatures we control trample. So in a traditional dragon tribal deck, where we're getting multiple dragons onto the battlefield as much as possible, this is going to trigger an awful lot, because we've got 2 or 3 dragons coming into play. It's going to put more cards into our hand. Again, we're shifting away from the traditional tribal sense of a dragon deck and putting it more onto Scion. So when Scion comes into play, although it does have a power of 4, when it comes into play, we want to keep it in play. And although the trample enablement could be helpful, a lot of the dragons that that we utilize Scion's ability to become a copy of until end of turn, they already have trample. So in my mind, Mystic Remora, in a true Scion-dependent build, Mystic Remora is going to put more cards into our hand than Garruk's Uprising can in a game. That's what we're going to see. We're gonna see about that. All right, so those are all of the, almost all of the non-dragon cards. Let's do it like this. Let's keep it dragon for dragon here. Okay. So what we're going to do next, no, let's do it like this. All right, so we're away from our ramp. We're away from our protection. We're away from our dragon synergies and some card draw. Now let's start putting in some of the pieces that used to be in this deck, making it more of a Scion-dependent build. The first dragon going back into the deck is going to be Nicol Bolas, the OG Bolas, the 7/7 that whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player discards their hand. Also notice that power of 7 is exactly 1/3 of what needs to be done by a commander to defeat an opponent with lethal commander damage. This was a fantastic early play to have an opponent dump their entire hand by activating Scion's ability to become a copy of Nicol Bolas. They strike for combat damage. That opponent discards their hand. They are at such a disadvantage that we can turn our attention on our other opponents while they're just sitting there drawing one card at a time. This is not a dragon I would ever want to cast. This is not a dragon I would ever want to tutor for. This is a dragon that I want in the library so that I can make Scion become a copy of it and have an opponent discard their hand. Blue mages hate to discard their hands. Well, then maybe they shouldn't be blue mages. For one type of quote-unquote card advantage going into the deck, which, let's face it, having an opponent discard their entire hand is advantageous to us in a card sense. With that card advantage card going in, we identified another card advantage card that's going to come out, and that's going to be, for the moment, Sensei's Divining Top. Now, we all know what the top does, and we know that we need to maximize what we're trying to do in a Scion deck. And I will say that we may, and again, this is going to be based on gameplay, of course. None of these changes are going to be cemented in stone, but we may lose its ability to filter the top 3 cards of our library to make sure that dragons like Nicol Bolas do not end up in our hand and they stay on the top of our library. We have other cards in this deck that does that better, particularly because we can put cards from our hand on top of our library, and with so many different ways to shuffle that library thereafter, we're talking about Scroll Rack, of course, Sensei's Divining Top kind of yields the power to Scroll Rack in this particular type of build. Having both in play is not really that great. So there have been times with a Scroll Rack and a Sensei's Divining Top, it's like this is a little bit of, we're kind of paralyzing ourselves here because utilizing both of those things are not the greatest. So what we decided to do is we decided to take out the Sensei's Divining Top because what Scroll Rack can do is so much better for the purposes of getting cards out of our hand, putting them back onto the library, as opposed to just filtering the top of our library instead. We're going to see how that goes in the future, of course, but for the moment right now, Bolas in, top out. All right, next up, we are going to put a win condition back in this deck and take one out. The win condition going in is Right of Replication. This is 2 in a blue. We put a token onto the battlefield that's a copy of target creature. But if we kick it by paying a total of 7 and 2 blue, we put 5 of those tokens onto the battlefield instead. We have many dragons in this build that if we can cast a kicked Right of Replication, targeting one of those creatures, we win the game on the spot. Scourge of Valkus is one. Terror of Peaks could do an amazing job. And we have a couple of dragons coming up that used to be in the deck that synergized with this spell beautifully during the time that they were all together in the 99. And with the kind of ramp that we have in this deck, it's not out of the realm of possibilities to have Scion in play, pay 2 mana, activate its ability to become a copy of one of these dragons, and then cast a kicked Right of Replication and win the game on the spot. So with that win condition coming in, that versatile win condition coming in, one's coming out, and that's going to be Hellkite Tyrant. Now, the Hellkite Tyrant was included in this deck because of the presence of building more of a treasure-themed dragon build. This happened during, I believe, the most recent appearance on the Up and Up series of this deck, where we kind of inflated some of the treasure synergies as a way in which to bolster the dragon tribe as we were trying to separate some dependence on our commander. But if we're going full-fledged with Scion as our commander, there are very few instances in which we're going to tap 2 to have Hellkite Tyrant become a copy of that. It's a 6/5 flyer, yes, it's only going to deal 6 damage, however. We would gain control of some nice artifacts if that player has any under their control, which they most likely will, but the win condition of having at least 20 or more at the beginning of our upkeep, we're going to forego that because we're twisting away from the treasure influence that we put into this build during the last appearance to go more with the Rite of Replication build. So for right now, Hellkite Tyrant's coming out to make room for Rite of Replication. Now, we're going to get into some of the dragons that we took out that synergize so well with Rite of Replication and how they're going to replace the dragons that they are in this build. The first one is Yosei. Yosei is a 5/5 with flying. When it dies, target player skips their next untap step, and we tap up to 5 permanents that player controls. If Yosei is on the battlefield, or if Scion taps to become a copy of Yosei, we can target it with Rite of Replication. We create 5 copies that come into play. They all must, well, I shouldn't say they all must die, but we have to pick 5 copies of Yosei to die due to the legend rule. We're not going to pick Scion to die, so we're going to pick all the tokens that were just made. Those tokens hit the graveyard immediately, but the 5 of them that came into play still were in play long enough, and they will have death triggers as we sacrifice them. So that's 5 Yosei death triggers, meaning that we can make one opponent skip 5 consecutive untap steps and have every single permanent of theirs tapped down during those 5 turns. I have done that many, many times in the past prior to Yosei's exile from this deck, and it is very, very powerful. Yosei going in, another dragon that's very similar to Yosei is Kokusho the Evening Star. This is a 5/5 with flying, of course, just like Yosei, but when Kokusho dies, each opponent loses 5 life, and we gain life equal to the life lost this way. So again, if we cast a kicked Rite of Replication targeting Kokusho after perhaps after activating Scion's ability, we'll put those 5 copies of Kokusho into play. We have to recognize the legend rule. Those 5 tokens are going to die. Each opponent's going to lose 25 life, and we gain X times 25 life, where X is the number of opponents we have. That is a massive swing in life that really ends up just leading to an imminent victory thereafter. Also, by including both of Yosei and Kokusho, we also have the ability to punish our opponents if any of them spot remove by destroying or making us sacrifice. If they make us have Scion die, then we can quick activate its ability, and if we really want to punish our opponents or we're low on life, we grab a Yosei, Scion becomes a copy of Yosei, or we grab Kokusho, Scion becomes a copy of Kokusho. Scion dies, we put it back into the command zone, but it does end up going to the graveyard first, so it does die, and the death triggers will trigger, and we will be able to do something about that. So that's another reason why we included those dragons in there, as a way in which to make our opponents stop and think, do I really want to have all of my permanents tapped down during next turn, or do I really want the Scion controller to gain 20 life? That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to make Scion feared again. All right, so those were 2 that went in, and a third that's coming back in. This is not just because of Rite of Replication, but this is also because it can help protect Scion and make him a beast in combat. We have Hellkite Overlord going back in. It's an 8/8 with flying, trample, and haste. It also has fire breathing. Whenever we tap a red mana, it gets +1/+0 till end of turn. And we can also pay a black and a green to regenerate Hellkite Overlord. So if somebody spot removes or casts a board wipe and Scion's on our side of the battlefield, if we have the mana available, we can activate his ability. It can become a copy of Hellkite Overlord. We pay Golgari colors, and we regenerate our commander. Or if we just cast Scion on our turn, we can quick tap 2 mana, make it Hellkite Overlord, and look, we've got haste, we've got flying, we've got trample, and since the land base and the mana base of this build are both tilted towards red, we should have more than enough red mana available to make sure that we can pump up Scion's power temporarily by activating the fire-breathing ability. So those 3 dragons that were staples in the traditional Scion deck are going back with Rite of Replication. With those 3 dragons going in, we had to find 3 dragons to take out, each of which are not going to be too much of a loss, except for the one that I'm not too sure about, but we're going to see how that goes. The first one coming out is going to be Goldspan Dragon. Again, with a dependence on Scion, when are we ever going to tap Scion to become a copy of Goldspan? Are we looking to just create a treasure token when somebody targets Scion with a spell? No, I don't think we're going to do that. We're not really doing too much with a treasure theme anymore now that Hellkite Tyrant is out and we're focusing more on our general. So it's kind of easy to bring a 4/4 out specifically because, let's face it, if we're going to activate Scion's ability, I don't imagine that Goldspan Dragon is going to be one of the top 15 choices that we're going to use either for the purposes of offense or defense. That makes Goldspan coming out, which, let's face it, Goldspan's a great dragon, but in a traditional dedicated Scion build, not so much. Not so much. All right, so that's the first dragon coming out for the Yosei Kokusho and Overlord trio. The second one coming out is going to be Blast Furnace Hellkite. So here what we have is a 5/5 dragon. It has Artifact Offering, but we're not worried about that because, again, we're focusing on Scion. It has flying, it has double strike, and then there's that little line of text that says creatures attacking your opponents have double strike. Yes, there is the potential to pay 2 mana on Scion when one opponent is attacking another opponent to have those creatures have double strike until end of turn. Because if this is a copy of Scion is a copy of this, then those creatures that are attacking are going to have double strike. However, that leaves Scion vulnerable to any spot removal, and we do not want to risk our general having spot removal. We necessarily don't need to have all of our creatures with double strike because, again, we're just worried about Scion. We have double striking dragons in the 99. We don't have to worry about whatever it is that Blast Furnace Hellkite can do. So it coming out in a Scion build is okay, especially because of this bottom ability here. Because let's face it, even if we were to get this onto the battlefield through one of our cheat into play effects, or if we actually just hard cast it, our opponents are going to see that they have double strike against their opponents, but maybe they all band together, which I've had happen, and they all just come after the Scion player. Scion already gets enough attention. Having Blast Furnace Hellkite on our side of the battlefield is not going to help to dissuade that any bit. All right, and the last creature coming into play, the last creature coming out is going to be Scourge of the Throne. This has been in this Scion deck for many, many, many moons. And it is one of the best cards that I used to tutor into the graveyard for the purposes of setting up a mass recursion spell like Living Death or Patriarch's Bidding, particularly because in a Scion deck, we're traditionally not going to have the most life total. So through the dethrone mechanic, this allows us to tap and send the Scourge into combat, and then we get to have another attack phase. I've been able to close out many a games with Scourge of the Throne in the graveyard alongside a bunch of other different dragons. Well, this is what ends up happening when a tribe just gets wave after wave after wave of amazingly powerful dragons. It then just becomes pecking order. And I gotta be honest with you, Scourge of the Throne is not as strong as it used to be. With so many different dragons that have been coming out in all of the different recent sets, I'm not saying that the Scourge is obsolete, not even close, but with all of the other things that some of these other dragons can do, keeping Scourge in play for the purposes of maybe having a Thunder of Dragons come from the graveyard into play and then attack an opponent that might have the most life total, or is tied for the most, or maybe isn't even. What if we have the most life? And Scourge of the Throne is just a 5/5 flying dragon. It just doesn't do enough anymore. I still like Scourge of the Throne. Maybe it finds its way back sometime in the future, but for the purposes of powering up this Scion build once again, it's going to come out for the time being. All right, we got 2 more revisions, and then we're bringing this long list of changes to a close. Going back in is Bladewing the Risen. It's a 4/4 flyer that when it comes into play, we may return a dragon permanent card from our graveyard to the battlefield. Note that if we activate Scion's ability to become a copy of Bladewing, we do not get to return that creature from our graveyard to the battlefield. This is an ETB trigger, and that is all. But keeping in mind, if you're familiar with the 99 of this dragon build, we have so many ways to cheat our dragons into play. We can cheat it into play with a sneak attack. We can cheat it into play with a monster manual. And when we do so, we are not paying the 7 CMC that this dragon costs. We're cheating it into play, and we're going to be bringing a dragon back into play from our graveyard that was most likely put there by activating Scion's ability. With Bladewing the Risen, we have a lot more versatility in what we can do because, let's face it, we're not ever going to pay that 7 CMC, and we can get those dragons back into play to help close out the game. With 1 form of graveyard recursion from a dragon going into the deck, 1 is going to come out, and that's going to be the Ancient Brass Dragon. Again, this is something that is not lost on me, that we are taking out another potential mass recursion spell, but it is a potential one, because we do have to make sure that we roll that D20 as best we can, plus the Ancient Brass Dragon has to strike for combat damage as well. Now, we could activate Scion's ability to become a copy of the Ancient Brass Dragon. It does have that 7 power, which, let's face it, 7/7/7, and some opponent is going home that day. But there's just a few too many hoops to jump through in order to get the best benefits out of Ancient Brass Dragon, particularly when we have an Enter the Battlefield trigger right here in Bladewing the Risen. Yes, Bladewing is going to be a little more restrictive in what it can bring back, but in a vacuum, we're not going to care about what's in our opponent's graveyards. We only care about what's in our graveyard from Scion, and Bladewing can fetch it better than the Ancient Brass Dragon. Remember, our primary activations of Scion are going to be to hurt our opponent's resources and or knock them out of the game. We still have the combos that can do that, so we have to ask ourselves, is Ancient Brass Dragon's presence in the deck going to help us do that? Or is replacing it with Bladewing going to help synergize what Scion is doing into the graveyard each time we activate its ability? For me, it's Bladewing. That's really where we're going to go with that. All right, 1 more change to go, and this is a change that I had been fighting off a little bit, but I'm going to rely on my instincts. I'm going to take the trustworthy suggestions and recommendations from a member of the MTG BC, Eric R., and he has been talking Piru the Volatile for many, many moons. So we're going to give it a whirl and see how we can do. With a 7/7 flying lifelink, that's not too bad. We're going to gain some life. We're going to deal that 7 points of damage again. But more importantly, however, is if Piru dies, it deals 7 damage to each non-legendary creature. So similar to what we were talking about with Kukusho and Yosei, changing Scion into Piru could help us gain a ton of life, not to mention that it could wipe out the board of nearly every non-legendary creature that's there with toughness 7 or less. Also keep in mind, if we were to have Piru as a copy, if we were to have Scion as a copy of Piru, targeting it with a kicked Right of Replication would put 5 of these onto the battlefield, and of course, because of the legend rule, they all die. They all are going to deal those 7 damage, and we are going to gain so much life that we may just end up hearing a round of good games right then and there. So we're going to give Piru a try, Eric R. We're going to see how it works, and we'll let you know. And a very simple change with Piru coming out and this no longer being a focused dragon tribal build looking more for what Scion can do. Out is going to come Wrathful Red Dragon. Whenever a dragon we control is dealt damage, it deals that much damage to any target that isn't a dragon. For the purposes of slinging around direct damage, it just seems like Piru can do a much better job of it than the Wrathful Red. Particularly because faced with the choice, if Scion is in play and Scion is about to take, I don't know, a blasphemous act, do we want to... Actually, we probably would want to have Wrathful Red Dragon in that instance, but in most other instances, we're going to want to have the damage dealt by Piru because it's going to help to clear the battlefield and gain us a ton of life, all of which the Wrathful Red just can't do. Let me know in the comments section, MTG BC, what do we think of these revisions? This is MTG Burgeoning, your channel for all things Magic.